Welcome to the Styxxoplix Show, episode 207, The Languages of Magic, with Toby, Chappell. How we doing today, Toby?
Hi,
This is
Styx. How are you?
WELT.
Good to talk to
Good.
you.
We're recording from WELT 95.7 FM out of Fort Wayne, Indiana. This is the radio room. So how's your afternoon going?
Going pretty good so far.
Maybe we can tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came about to be the writer, artist, magician, and musician that you are today with an
Sure.
introduction.
So
Sure.
I, mhm. So I am a linguist and a semiotician by training and trade, I guess you say. After a bit of a detour through the tech industry for a number of years, but I left that behind as of a couple of years ago. I'm a long time enthusiast of the weird and the strange and the magical. And The Languages of Magic is my second book. My first book from 2019 is called Infernal Geometry and the Left-Hand Path. It takes a look at the philosophy of Pythagoras, the number mysticism of Pythagoras, combined with things like the writings of H.P. Lovecraft and how that sort of manifested in the teachings of the Church of Satan and then later the Temple of Set, from Anton LaVey to Michael Aquino. Um, and in that book, I wrote a bit about the semiotics of magic, and at one point had an idea that that might make a pretty good full-length book. And so for my second book, eventually decided that that's what I would write, and that's what became The Languages of Magic. So in The Languages of Magic, I take a hard look at the history and theory of linguistics and semiology and semiotics, and how those are a critical component of magic. So that's been just a long time component of my thought, these long years, and it's sort of my main area of focus at this point is how those things all intermesh.
Okay. Now, what was the maybe past inspirations for getting into the Lovecraft Nine Angles signs
Mhm.
and stuff like that?
For sure. So I've been a long time enthusiastic reader of H.P. Lovecraft. I adore his fiction. The person not so much, but I think we all kind of know some of the issues there. But the worlds that he built and the way that he thought about the functioning of the universe is endlessly fascinating. And ironically, Lovecraft had a pretty dim view of magic. Some of that was influenced by the magicians of the day that he was familiar with, but some of it was also his very stringently rationalist, materialistic worldview, which is very strange when you think about it because of the way that he used dreams and other um, non non-Euclidean ways of looking at the world, for someone who was convinced that everything was simply matter and energy and the laws that control them. He had quite a bit of a connection to other ways of thinking and other ways of looking at the eternal mysteries that we deal with as humans within a cosmos that really cannot care less about us. So we have to create ourselves. We have to create our own meaning within it. And Lovecraft was very adept at that. Um, Now, that being said, because he was able to, uh, within the context of his fiction, where it was safe for him, if you will, to
Hmm.
move beyond just that kind of very mechanistic view of the world, it provided a very rich tapestry for magicians to work with, especially on the darker side of things. And that was initially what LaVey and Aquino picked up on. Now, one of the things that Michael Aquino did with that, so a bit of a background, most people are familiar with LaVey's The Satanic Bible. They think of that as kind of his main work, and it is in a lot of ways. One of his follow-up works to that was something called The Satanic Rituals, and because he was pressed for time and for other reasons, he asked Michael Aquino, who was sort of his um, second in command in the church, if you will, at the time, if he would contribute some rituals based off the works of H.P. Lovecraft. And these Aquino did. There was an essay called The Metaphysics of Lovecraft. There was a ritual called The Ceremony of the Nine Angles, and another one called The Call to Cthulhu. And these were based off of different aspects of Lovecraft's work, thinking about what if Lovecraft um, had an actual magical point of view, what would it look like? And I mentioned earlier the connection with Pythagoras. So there, if you look at so most people think of Cthulhu when they think of Lovecraft and his deities, which is kind of ironic because Cthulhu is not that big of a player in Lovecraft's fiction. He has one story named after him, and I think there's one or two kind of minor mentions. But there are other elder gods that he mentions much more often that really form the basis of his cosmology, what he called cosmicism, the idea that we are, adrift in black seas of infinity, as he called it, and we have to kind of create ourselves, and that consciousness is really not a boon to us, but in fact is a horrible joke played on us by the universe. So
Cosmic joke. Oh,
yeah,
okay.
exactly, pretty grim stuff. And that did pretty much reflect Lovecraft's actual view, and the view of later people like Thomas Ligotti and others that kind of ran with that as a philosophical underpinning. Um, but um, for elder gods that Lovecraft did write about, Azathoth, Yog-Sothoth, Nyarlathotep, and Shub-Niggurath, do figure in many ways much more prominently than Cthulhu in the mythos, especially Nyarlathotep. And these are sort of the basis for what Aquino decided to construct as what if these were sort of like these building blocks of a ever complex universe that we as conscious beings and also potentially as magicians could then utilize and take advantage of. And so that was sort of the basis of it, and then he mixed in some ideas from Pythagoras and the number mysticism of Pythagoras. The idea of the monad, the dyad, the triad, tetrad, and so forth, and sort of combined this into what he called the nine angles, which he constructed as a pentagram and a trapezoid, where you have the upper points coinciding. In fact, this is the book Infernal Geometry in the Left-Hand Path, and you can see here the trapezoid and the pentagram combined together. I should probably
Yes.
mention, just because it is sometimes confused, unfortunately, by the naming, that the pseudo group that calls itself the Order of the Nine Angles is, other than taking the name from the Ceremony of the Nine Angles, has nothing to do with anything that I'm talking about. That's a complete different thing that's unfortunately become what people sometimes think of when they hear the name Nine Angles, but it has nothing to do with what I'm speaking of here.
Okay.
Um, and so, as I said, Aquino sort of took these ideas and combined them into his Ceremony of the Nine Angles, and also in the Call to Cthulhu. And these sort of form the basis of a magical system that can be created out of them. That's largely what the book Infernal Geometry is about.
Ah. Oh, did you have any correspondence with Michael Aquino while he was
Yes,
alive?
I knew him personally.
Okay.
I'm also a Magister Templi in the Temple of Set organization founded by Michael Aquino, and had a not as close as some, but had a fairly close relationship with him. Was a guest in his home multiple times, correspondent, a frequent
Okay.
correspondent with him, etc. He was well, he was supportive enough of it that he wrote the foreword for the book.
Ah, the forward. Okay, gotcha.
Right.
Right.
And then Stephen Flowers wrote an afterword for it. Stephen Flowers is really the one that kind of took the ideas from the Ceremony of the Nine Angles and the Call to Cthulhu and expanded them into more of a fully fledged magical system. Aquino was, by and large, was content to plant the seeds of ideas and let others run with them. Other than the temple itself, there were he would create things and pass them on and let others kind of flesh them out into something deeper. But because of his critical importance of it, sort of the seed of the idea there of combining Lovecraft and Pythagoras and how do you make this into potentially into a magical system, it was important to me to have his blessing for the project, which he did, of course, but also to have him kind of
Okay.
contribute something to kind of set the stage for it and sort of the how we got here and then where it's going to go in the rest of the book there.
I'm gonna make a quick switch with the headphones. It keeps cracking up on me. Maybe you could
Okay.
elaborate more on the history of the Temple of Set and the Order of Trapezoid and how you came about to be in this organization.
Sure, for sure. So, the Church of Satan was sort of where this begins. The story begins in a sense. Was founded in 1966 by Anton LaVey. There was the first, arguably the first. It's maybe a bit disputed, but arguably the first sort of organized attempt at making Satanism as a practice and a religion. And I do say religion deliberately, despite the LaVey's kind of later atheistic kind of stance. It's pretty clear from his early writings that he did view this more as a religion in the early days. So around 1975, LeVay decided he needed to monetize this in some way, far beyond what had been done before, and made some decisions that many people who were working within the system disagreed with, and there was a bit of a kind of a breakaway from there, and that's what the Temple of Set arose out of. The Temple of Set was founded by Michael Aquino in 1975, with a number of people who were at that point formally part of the original Church of Satan. And one of the main things that set the temple apart was that Aquino and others saw that the archetype of Satan was rather limiting. That if you see it, as a product of the Judeo-Christian system in which it arose, and see it as primarily as sort of an adversary against other things rather than a creative thing in and of itself, this is ultimately limiting because once you kind of break away from another belief system, or you break away from other ways of thinking, you need kind of a now what, and there wasn't really a now what that was part of the church's thinking.
Hmm.
And along with this came the reorientation towards Set instead of Satan. Set to the Temple of Set and to Michael Aquino is there's the Egyptian god Set, which we see as the oldest name for what we call the Prince of Darkness, meaning the archetype of isolate intelligence within the world, within the universe, and the template, if you will, for what it means to be a self-aware, self-evolving being. And so we don't work exclusively with Egyptian things. We don't work exclusively with Set, but that is the sort of the oldest name for that principle at work within the world. We give great respect to that as a result. Um, the the temple works through other cultural spheres as well because different cultures have different perspectives on what the actual causal principles behind gods. Gods are culturally determined, but they speak to something deeper, and that something deeper can have other expressions in other places. So that brings us to the Order of the Trapezoid. The Order of the Trapezoid was um, sort of conceived of by LaVey as something within the Church of Satan. He was conceiving of it as from a sort of a Germanic perspective. So thinking about Wagner, the heroic archetypes based out of old, primarily Old Norse mythology and the like. But he was also very enamored by things like German expressionist film and this sort of doppelganger of the public face, the Church of Satan, and having kind of this hidden thing behind it that was
Hmm.
sort of the deeper aspect in a sense. Now, the Order of the Trapezoid was just kind of an idea with LeVay. He liked to throw it around as a sounds spooky and also sounds like, oh, I have access to something the rest of you don't kind of thing. But it was never really
Hmm.
much more than an idea in his head. Within the Temple of Set, it was reformed as specifically what we call an order within the temple, which is sort of a kind of a specific school of thought within the temple that focuses on a specific magical idea, magical technique, magical perspective, etc. And so it has been more fleshed out within the temple in terms of the Germanic views of magic and the Prince of Darkness, which we see Odin as a version of a culturally determined version of the Prince of Darkness archetype, etc. So it's kind of interesting to look at Set versus Odin because they kind of show a couple of different things that are very useful. Um, the roots of the name Set mean something along the lines of separation or to separate. So Set to the Egyptians was the god that was kind of against the other gods, was against the cosmic order, kind of separate himself out. And indeed, the people that were considered Setians within ancient Egypt that worshipped or otherwise worked with the god Set were typically the outsiders. Were people like the navigators in the desert. These were um, the people that oriented by the stars. These were people that were kind of outside of the typical society. Now, from the Germanic perspective with Odin, the roots of Odin's name mean master of inspiration. And we see this in stories like the winning of the poetic mead, where Odin is trying to recover the mead that gives inspiration that the poets need in order to have this ecstatic understanding that they put out into the world through words. Um, so to me, that kind of dichotomy is pretty interesting because you have the necessity of separating from the natural order of things, of finding your own way, creating your own way, But you also have the what do you do with this? Well, you need to find the inspiration to become something other than you are, to become ever more, and that's where the inspiration comes in. So these kind of capture two sides of the coin, if you will, on that. Um,
So that's what you go more into the path. The left-hand path is becoming more individualistic as far as
yes,
the path
that
is
that that
concerned.
is that is the core of it. Is to recognize and to cultivate your own individuality, your own sense of aesthetics, your own sense of your own needs. It doesn't mean that we withdraw from the world, because for better or worse, we work within the world. We're not a monastic temple or order where you're supposed to go out in the desert and ignore the rest of humanity. We put a great emphasis on working within and among other humans, because that's what you need. You need others in order to help you become more of what yourself is. You need others to help you see your own limitations. You need others to help you see what other possibilities are out there. You need others to give you that critical reflection on who it is that you really are. And so it is an interactive, intersubjective relationship with others. But we do it driven first and foremost by our own needs, by our own perspectives. We just don't we don't ignore the expectations of others, but we put greater primacy onto our own.
Hmm. Okay. The powers that be are coming against me with this technical difficulties. The headphones is cracking up. I can barely follow you. That's why you're mostly leading it right now. So I wanted to ask you a question about the music. How you got into the music part of it, esoteric music with ambient doom and
Hmm.
uh, uh,
Sure.
electroacoustics, is it? Or
Yeah. So this is kind of intertwined with my kind of beginnings as a magician, if you will. I grew up in the Deep South, in the 1980s, primarily, kind of the middle of the so-called Satanic Panic,
mm,
and started kind of became a metalhead around 1986, 1987, and back then it's easy to imagine that all your favorite bands are secretly in league with the devil, right? Turns out they're not for the most part.
right, right, right.
Few isolated exceptions, but it's the point is not whether they are or aren't. The point is whether what that kind of awakens in you and what you then follow as a result of that. Um, I believe very strongly that, whatever the inspiration was that kind of brought you to a place, you still honor that inspiration, even if you take it in other directions, because it's what opened your eyes. You need to, respect what opened your eyes to something else than what you were stuck in. So I began to play guitar around that time, around 1987. And this is around the same time that you have things like on the Geraldo Rivera show at the time and
Ah,
Oprah, where you have these exposés about Satanism, right? And as it happened, Michael Aquino and his wife Lilith were guests on for both Geraldo and Oprah, and I saw both of those. Now it was
okay.
interesting. It was an interesting contrast because I knew enough about the practices and beliefs of the Church of Satan at the time to understand that what the sensationalist stuff that they were saying was not right. That there was actually something deeper going on there. Um, and so these are really kind of coming out of the same time period for me, that kind of opening my eyes to different ways of thinking and being and becoming. So I've been in different bands at different points, and in the early 2000s I began to get more interested in non-guitar based music, and that was around the same time that I joined the Temple of Set originally, and I was began to think about, well, how would you use magic? Sorry, excuse me. How would you use music as a magical tool? Um, Thinking, okay, if music is such an important part of my life, then that means it needs an important part of magic as well. How do you combine the two? And so you did a lot of experimentation with that, both on music that pre-recorded music, but also music that I created for those purposes, where some of it you set the right mood. Some of it you do things like you encode magic into the music in some ways, whether it's in the lyrical content or whether it's in the case of the if you take inspiration from certain works and then kind of channel that in some way into the music. And when I started to work with computer-based music, I spent a couple of years in not degree seeking, but in music school was kind of like a respite from my job for a couple of years, and worked with a professor there who was a pretty well-known name in academic computer music, and so learned quite a bit from him, and including what sometimes is referred to as algorithmic music, where you're sort of like creating like a program that creates the notes for you, but you're still
Hmm.
making the notes. So this is years before AI, so it has nothing to do with any of that. Um, so I would do things like take like a specific text, magical text, and create rules that say, okay, if I see these letters in it or these words in it, then create these notes. And so kind of feed it into there and have it generate, okay, take the text, turn it into music that sort of in a sense kind of encodes or translates that into music. Um, and got pretty deep into that for a while. It's not as much of what I'm doing at the moment, but it is still part of my musical DNA. And so a lot of that experimentation kind of corresponded with magical experimentation as well. So these are kind of very tightly coupled in my work, both in terms of using music as part of magical practices, but also approaching music with a magical mindset, as in a creative, self-documenting um, mindset, if you will. The idea of like using music as a magical diary. If I like to create a piece of music, I can, if I hear it later, I remember, oh, that's where I was at the time. It's where I lived. That's what I was doing. That's what my thoughts were, etc. So it kind of captures some of who you are at a given point in time. And I think any musician that's kind of making music for authentic and honest reasons, not just for commercial reasons, but because they're really trying to express something about themselves, it's going to reflect who they are at that point in time. And you
Hmm.
can listen to music from a certain time in your life and have it kind of bring back this flood of everything about who you were then. And if you're lucky, you'd be able to see that as the how far you've come since then, how you've been transformed and how you've transformed yourself in that intervening time as well.
Now, did you get an inspiration from Electric Wizard and John Zorn, perhaps? Or
Electric Wizard, not so much, but Zorn certainly. I love John
yeah,
Zorn's. He had a couple of works. Magic was the title of one of them, and
IAO, you had one.
yeah, that's the one I was trying to think of. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, because he was very much, or is, very much into kind of, especially Crowley, Aleister Crowley's practices of magic, and
Yeah.
kind of expressing that in his own idiosyncratic way, I guess you'd say. Um, but yeah, there are a number of musicians out there that have, to greater or lesser extent, have incorporated this. I mean, Coil especially. Coil is a huge influence on me
Coil. Right,
for those
right, right.
reasons. Because they're
Yeah.
very much. I mean, they were originally part of Throbbing Gristle, one of the kind of the primary industrial bands, but that was also part of the Temple of Psychic Youth, sort of a quasi chaos magic kind of offshoot of some of the things happening in the UK music, magic, and art scene in the late 70s. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, hugely inspirational, and sadly missed. I think most of the members of Coil have passed on at this point, creating different
Yeah.
music in other realms. Maybe we get to hear it after we're gone from here.
Yeah. So, what about the Weird Tales authors besides H.P. Lovecraft? Those are new names to me as far as Stefan
Hmm.
Grabinski, Frank
Hmm.
Belap Long,
Hmm.
and I'm aware of Thomas Ligotti. I know his book, A Conspiracy Against the Human Race, which I've
Right.
read. But
Yep. Yeah. Legati is contemporary. Those other two you mentioned are the much older. So,
yeah.
yeah, I'm a very much a connoisseur of kind of what's called the classic Weird Tales era. So we're talking about like 1920s to like early 1940s, give or take. Now, Lovecraft was the center of that, not only stylistically, but also Lovecraft was a very voluminous, very prolific letter writer. So he exchanged numerous letters, and many of them have been saved and published at different points, with early writers like Clark Ashton Smith and Robert E. Howard, who both were very famous in their own rights. Uh, but other people who became famous later, like Robert Bloch, the author of Psycho, that the movie was based off of,
Oh yeah, 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 yeah.
Block was a very young man when Lovecraft was alive, but Lovecraft gave him encouragement, gave him tips, gave him feedback on his work, etc. Even incorporated him into one of the stories. The character Robert Blake in The Haunter of the Dark, which is, for my money, one of Lovecraft's finest stories, was basically revenge on Block because Block killed Lovecraft in one of his stories, and
Hmm.
Lovecraft killed
Okay.
Block in one of his stories in return. Um, but you mentioned Frank Belknap Long. So Long is a very, very interesting cat in a lot of ways. And again, he was a very young man at the time he was corresponding with Lovecraft. Um, uh, One of the most famous, or at least one of the most potent stories from Long is a story called The Hounds of Tyndalos. Actually, if you hang on just a second. Um,
Okay.
so just because the cover is so badass, I have to show it. So this was from 1946. This was the cover of a compilation
The
called The
Hounds
Hounds
of
of Tyndalos,
Tyndalos. Okay.
which included the story of that name, among others. Um, so introduced this idea of what's called curved time and angular time, which later becomes part of the way we view the nine angles. It's become a very integral part of my own magical practices. So what the difference is between the two? So curved time is the time of the orderly cosmos. So it's how like you basically see the clock ticking on the wall. Uh, Not that people have clocks that tick on the wall anymore, but people still know what you mean by that at least. So basically, it's time as you see it from the external objective perspective. So it's kind of like time is unfolding as we normally think of time. Well, angular time is different. Angular time as experienced by an individual person subjectively. So it may go faster or slower than the clock time. It may go in a non-linear fashion. It may bounce around. If you think about like, where does inspiration come from? You're thinking about one thing and suddenly you get an idea, or suddenly you think of something you were trying to think of. Um, so angular time is the kind of the internal subjective time that we experience. And those perspectives, Long was just trying to write a good story, but
Right.
because he tapped into something there, it becomes something that can be used as something that you can um, that changes your understanding of yourself if you start to think of it in those same kind of metaphorical terms. Um, so that story is from like 1929, I believe. So a lot of that very old stuff I'm very much a fan of. Lovecraft primarily, but also Clark Ashton Smith is very famous. And one of the interesting things about that, partly because they were corresponding all the time, but they were also fans of each other's work. So when you
Yeah.
have in, the Weird Tales magazine, which is kind of where the name for the genre Weird Tales kind of comes from. So if you have Lovecraft's writing thing, he's writing about like the Necronomicon, right? And you think, oh, that's not it's not listed in the card catalog. It doesn't exist. He just
Huh.
made it up for the story. But then what happens? You go read a story by Clark Ashton Smith, and he mentions it too. Then you go read a story by Frank Belknap Long, and he mentions it. And you start to think, hey, wait a minute, maybe this is some obscure thing that these guys know about, right? So
Hmm.
they were consciously engaged in myth building with each other. Lovecraft was very open to using his characters, his ideas, and by other people, and kind of giving their own take on them, which is really what happens with mythology in general, if you think about it. Sometimes people misunderstand mythology and think of it as, oh, it's just like a primitive attempt to understand science. Like, no, that's not what it's
Hmm.
about. That's modern thinking applied to pre-modern people. What myth is, in a lot of, in many cases, it is the it, they're trying to convey something that they think is internally true, and there's no one definitive this is the myth and this is the only way it can go. That's why you sometimes have different stories about the same gods or the same cultural perspective on the cosmos that contradict each other in different details. And it's not because they couldn't get their act together or because they didn't know what they're talking about. It's because each person has their own perspective. Each person brings it out in their own way, and each person develops it in their own way. But the things that they're the core ideas behind it are the part that matters, not the little details. The details are just trying to tell the story in a way that conveys the deeper truth behind it. So what Lovecraft, Smith, Howard, Long, and these others were doing by kind of sharing this mythos, by developing that in each in their own directions, is they're creating myth together. They're creating neo-mythology in a sense.
Mythos. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, that's why I mentioned earlier that Cthulhu mythos is kind of a misnomer because Cthulhu is not actually that prominent of a character in Lovecraft.
Yeah.
You could argue that the Necronomicon mythos is maybe the more accurate name for it because that's actually something that does pop up again
Ah,
and again and again, not
okay,
only
that
in
makes
Lovecraft's
sense.
works but also in the works of others. Um, because you have people like Robert E. Howard wrote some backstory for the Necronomicon. Clark Ashton Smith kind of incorporated it into his own stories among his own kind of invented texts. Um, it became this kind of glue, the pursuit of this mysterious book that is reputed to exist, and they write stories about people that possess it and go mad as a result, or that people, they go crazy from trying to find the thing or trying to understand it. So really, that's the glue as much as anything else, and that's what a lot of the authors in that time, because they were all part of what's called the Lovecraft Circle. They were all
Hmm.
corresponding with Lovecraft and with each other. Um, and so he really was Lovecraft himself was the glue holding that group of people together, but the Necronomicon was kind of the idea that held those things together.
Now, is there speculation about who wrote the Necronomicon and the Gates of Necronomicon? Is that Peter Lavenda, Simon, or is that actually two different people?
Lavinda is Simon.
Okay.
He's mostly given up on stringently denied these days. He'll kind of soft admit it, but it was. Um, I know an acquaintance of mine from the temple who was part of the scene centered around a bookstore called the Magical Child in the late 70s in New York. There was a man named Herman Slater who ran the store, and it was kind of the centerpiece of the occult scene in New York at the time. Lavinda was part of that.
Hmm.
Uh, Probably the most prominent name that had to come out of it at this point. But Yeah, so all that kind of came out of there originally. They're kind of collaborating on the ideas, experimenting with the different takes on the rituals and the like. That was the same time that the Ordo Templi Orientis, or the OTO, which was very closely associated with the Crowley, was kind of becoming revitalized within New York around the same time. It was again a lot of the same people, and so forth. But yeah, that was definitely Lavinda there. Now that being said, but see, that's the thing. Like knowing, okay, it's really this guy, whatever. In my mind, doesn't diminish what he created out of it, um, because regardless, like somebody wrote it down, right? So in a sense, doesn't really
Yeah.
matter who wrote it down, right?
Okay.
Or compiled it, is what Simon claims to have done, is
Hmm.
edit and compile. Um, Now, if you read through that version of the Simon Necronomicon, very little of it is that much derived from Lovecraft directly. They pulled in a lot of Mesopotamian kind of ideas, some of which are correct, some of which were either misinterpreted or kind of changed a little bit in the process. Um, uh, but yeah, I mean, it still makes for something pretty potent. And that's one of those key things I think with using weird tales or taking inspiration from weird tales as a magician is it doesn't matter if it's quote made up because everything you work with was made
Hmm.
up at some point.
Hmm.
Somebody created even if you're working with some deep mythological tradition, well, somebody at some point made it up, maybe multiple someones, right?
Hmm.
So it was made up. It doesn't. That's a irrelevant thing to worry about. What really matters,
So
I
is
think.
it irrelevant as far as like the communications with Crowley had with AWAs and other mysterious entities and stuff like that? Or
Well, okay. Well, that depending on your perspective on that, and there are Crowley was adamant that it was a disembodied intelligence that he heard within the room.
hmm.
Um, Now, so it also happened to speak in the same way that one of the attendants at the hotel he was living at the time spoke. So,
Hmm.
but who knows there? Um, for me, the parts that matter about that is it a meaningful part of the story or not? Um,
Hmm.
but ultimately, it's even if it was, this is even if this is some transmission from some extraterrestrial or in the not from this earth sense intelligence. What gives something like that its authenticity, and from my point of view, is the changes that result from you working with it. Can you use this in a positive way? Cool. Then what difference does the origin really make at that point?
Okay.
If you think that it only has worth because it was some transmission of that sort, I think you're going to get less out of it at that point than if your focus is on just what can I do with this. Um, Otherwise, you're just doing what's called the appeal to authority is a logical fallacy. The idea that it has value because some person in authority said it. Well, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but value value from some guy on the street can still change your life, right?
Hmm.
You
Right.
can still hear you can so like it's part of the story, but it should never be the whole story, I think is what I'm trying to say there. Because
Okay.
I think if you try to make it the whole story, then I think the priority is misplaced a little bit. But if the focus on um, that this opens my eyes in interesting ways toward new possibilities, and even if its origin is part of that inspiration, I think that's very helpful. But for me, ultimately, it comes down to what is the actual effects of this knowledge
Hmm.
on you.
Okay. This is crazy with the headphones, man. Like I got super technical difficulties. I hope you're able to still.
I can hear you fine. So
You can hear me
so,
just fine.
sorry
It's
you're not able
just
to hear me. I hope on the recording
yeah,
it
it
ends
keeps
up coming
cracking
across
up,
clear.
but that's okay. And we're covering ground though.
Good.
um, how about I wanted to check out your Infernal Geometry website again. Okay, the runes and other topics from the Northern Germanic tradition.
Hmm.
Now about the runes, that's been a recent interest of mine as far as like Stephen Flowers books and
Hmm.
all the what do you call it, Futhark
The
or
Futhark, yeah.
Futharkia? Yeah, maybe we can elaborate on that and your
Sure.
discoveries.
So the place I think to start with the runes is actually with the name. And the
Okay.
reason is most people with a casual familiarity with the runes associate them with the symbols. The system of writing, which was a legitimate, real system of writing used by the early Germanic peoples for writing. They didn't write long form texts in them, but they did write um, short inscriptions on various objects because they were for the most part not a literate culture. And I'm speaking of them as if it's a unified thing. We're talking about many tribes that were broadly grouped under Germanic, and that they
Okay.
gradually spread across Europe and gradually fractured and so on and so forth. Um, so we're talking about the time period. It's a little bit uncertain, but it's certainly by the beginning of the Common Era, and definitely within like the first couple of centuries of that. So talking about up to like the year 200 or so, the year zero, if you will, up to the year 200 or so, when this
Mm.
sort of begins. And now, um, the name rune actually, or runa, runa more
Runa.
specifically, which is kind of the root of it, actually means mystery. It can
Okay.
also mean like a whispering or like a secret as well, but they all kind of carry that connotation of something mysterious, something beyond the ordinary. And it's only later that that becomes used as the name for the symbols themselves as well. Now,
Okay.
one of the things that's interesting about the runes, and I'm going to talk kind of specifically about the Elder Futhark, which is the earliest form of the runes. So some of the symbols were adapted from probably a North Etruscan alphabet. Jury's still a bit out on that exactly, but something
Mm.
North Italic, something in that area in that time frame, because the German tribes often worked as mercenaries for the Roman Empire, so they were very well connected um, with the military spread of the empire throughout Europe, and so
Mm.
they were picking up not just on they weren't just there to like to pick up payment. They were you pick up culture, you pick up language, you pick up ideas, etc. So
Mm.
they would have been exposed to the idea of writing. They would have been exposed to symbols. Now, one of the things that's interesting is about the runes is the alphabets that they were in part adapted from. The names of the letters in those alphabets don't mean anything. They're just arbitrary names for those symbols. When they were adapted by the Germanic peoples, they they have name. Each of the runes has a name,
Hmm.
and the name is of a real thing that matters. So, for example, the first rune is called Fehu, and that was the word for cattle or for mobile wealth, which is,
Hmm.
you have more cattle, you have more wealth, you have more, trading power to get the things you need. It also
Okay.
means you control more land, which, we also associate with wealth. Um, the name of the second rune is called Uruz, which was the Germanic name for uh, a now extinct bovine called the aurochs, which used to be it's a very big, much bigger than modern cows. There was basically this fierce beast that was in the forest in Europe until I think the last one was killed in captivity, like in the year 1500, give or take.
Huh.
So these are like big, dangerous. They were also like big, dangerous animals, but they were also used for food occasionally, and they was also used by the Germanic tribes as basically one of the parts of the rite of passage to enter into manhood was basically you had to go kill one of these things, which was a very difficult thing to do, very dangerous
Huh.
thing to do.
Aurochs, you say?
Yeah, Aurochs.
Aurochs.
Yeah,
Huh.
Aurochs, I think is how it's normally spelled.
Okay.
Um, and so on. So each of these names has a meaning, and you the other thing that you see there is it starts with F U the TH sound, A, etc., instead of A, B, C, D, E, F, G, right? So they didn't keep the order of the sounds either. They kind of kept some of the way that they looked, but that was about it. And
Hmm.
so um, it's hard to say things definitively about this, but it seems fairly likely based off a lot of the evidence that's available that this was not arbitrary. This wasn't just they're too dumb to remember it goes A B C D E F G, right? This was that there was a reason they grouped these things in this way, and in fact, you can if you various people have done work with them where if you kind of you can look at them in pairs and you can see certain parallels. Or for example, Fehu cattle and Aurochs, this wild bovine. I mean, they're related in some way, right? You have domesticated and wild, you have
Yeah.
yeah, etc. So um, and so this become so the runes were not just a way of writing; they're also a way of kind of thinking about the world. They're a way of taking 24. There were 24 runes originally. They're a way of taking 24 um, specific viewpoints on mystery and using them in order to understand the universe, both in writing, where you literally are taking something, you're writing it into existence in the world. You're adding something to something that already exists in the world, something that's the product of your mind, the product of your understanding. Um, but also, it was kind of the introduction of writing, so they were like short inscriptions and the like. The runes later change in various ways into in a couple of different systems of runes and the like. Um, uh, Again, this is as the Germanic tribes are becoming further and further disconnected from each other. They're spreading around. When you have, for example, when the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes end up settling the island of Britain, become the Anglo-Saxons and bring their language, and this is what eventually evolves into Old English, and then into Middle English and Modern English, for example.
Ah.
They had some different runes that they added at the same time. You also have in the Viking Age, which starts in usually taking a start in the year 793. Um, that was around the same time that Old Norse as a language was becoming distinct, and so they had a they actually reduced the number of runes from 24 to 16, altered a couple of the shapes, etc. Um, um, and it's there in the so we're talking about what's now Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and also Iceland, um, where you start to have a lot of writing is happening in runes. You have like all the rune stones start to pop up, where you have like entire you know sentences and paragraphs of inscriptions on stones and the like. Now, curiously, they didn't write down their own myths and the like in runes for the most part. They were using the Latin alphabet as well, because of the
Hmm.
influence of the church, and that was just the normal thing you wrote in. So they were using the runes for like special writing purposes still. Same thing with the Angles and the Saxons. Um, so okay, so that's all like just kind of the linguistic sort of historical perspective on it. So what does that have to do with magic stuff, right? So now it's clear that some early runic inscriptions are probably just maker's marks and the like. It's like this is mine kind of stuff.
Hmm.
Write my name on it. But there
What
are
kind of
others
territorial? Okay.
yeah, but there are others that contain other information um, that that were probably magical in intent, or at least partially magical in intent. Because I'm definitely not one of those people, and nor is Stephen Flowers, nor many people that work with the runes specifically as magic, of the mind that runes are always and only magical. That's preposterous. Um,
Okay.
but um, but it's hard to deny based off of a lot of the historical evidence that they were at times employed for magical means. Um, where you see things like you see inscribing like the name of Odin on spearheads. It's not Odin. Odin's not going to come and claim his spear most likely. If he does, you
Wow.
better look out. Um,
Right.
but for example, there where there was a common practice of if you're beginning a battle, you took a spear and you hurled it over the enemy to basically to show that they belong to Odin, meaning basically you're about to be killed, right, and be sent to Valhalla. Um, so something like writing the name of Odin or something associated with Odin on the spearhead before you hurl it, that's a semiotic act. You're adding symbolism to what you're doing. You're not just throwing the spear and hoping you hit somebody.
Hmm.
You're symbolizing that you belong to Odin now, but you're driving it home by inscribing the name of your weapon with the name of the god or things associated with the god in order to kind of drive home the point, basically. You're adding to the symbolism, which is what magic really is in a lot of ways. It's working with specific symbolism in order to shape a new reality that you want to come into being. Um, so looking ahead, kind of the sort of the modern kind of practices with runes in the late 19th century in the German-speaking lands, because Germany wasn't united until 1871 into an actual country called Germany. Um,
Oh, okay.
you have this is like the time that Wagner's writing his works. This is the time
Yeah.
that Ludwig II of Bavaria is creating like his like magical castles, the Cinderella Castle in Neuschwanstein, for example.
Right.
So this
King
is
Ludwig
there.
II. Yeah.
Well, yeah, there's a lot of interest in their
Hmm.
past. There's a lot of interest in what
Yeah.
were the older beliefs predating. They knew that there was something predating Christianity in their beliefs, and they're kind of looking back to that and trying to understand what it was. And some even beginning to try to reconstruct and practice what those things were to the extent that you can reconstruct them at this point. So there was an Austrian mystic, if you will, named Guido von List,
Ah,
who basically began to write about the runes. Now he was writing from a kind of a um, uh, kind of mythological perspective, I guess you'd say. He was trying to kind
okay.
of re-inspire work and belief in these things. So he's not writing a lot of practical, go do this and this and this with the runes. He's writing about this is what the runes mean. This is their inner meaning, their inner purpose, their inner character. And there were others in Germany in the early 20th century who kind of ran with his ideas um, and did flesh them out into more kind of practical systems. Now, they were not trying to recreate what was done 2,000 years earlier, 1,900 years earlier at that point. They were trying to recast it in a modern form. They were trying to take inspiration from it, trying to understand it as best they could, and see what practices make sense to us now. So they would often kind of bring in some kind of syncretic things from other traditions, like they bring in like the tarot and ideas from theosophy and the like. Um, and so you have like a core cluster of runic magicians in Germany around that time. Um, this is the subject of there's a book by it's Edward Thorson, who is Stephen Flowers, called Rune Might. It's called secret practices of the 20th century German rune magicians or something like that. And
Hmm.
he writes about the specific things that these guys wrote about. So there's people like Kumer, Marby, Schwiesberger, and the like. Um, and when Stephen Flowers was introduced to the runes, this was in 1974. I'm not going to go into the whole story, although it is pretty fascinating and interesting. But suffice it to say
Right.
that he was on an adventure one day in Texas. He was a college student at the time, but he's a pretty lackadaisical one by his own admission. He was kind of vaguely into various occult things, but he wasn't serious about any of it. It was just interesting stuff to do at the time. In the
Hmm.
70s were a great time for that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Because you can make up anything and people believe it around
Right.
around magic and the like then. Pre-internet people were not as interested in the actual facts. But anyway,
Hmm.
so he hears the word Runa whispered into his ear on on this trip that he's on, and he intuits maybe this has something to do with runes, and he's like, oh, what does that mean? What should I do with this? So again, like I was saying earlier, like um, the fact that he heard it whispered in his ear is not the point. The point is what he did with it later. The point is, I mean, it becomes part of the story. It's an important part of the story, but the the work he develops is what has the real value because that's what you can read. You can't hear the things whispered into his own ear, but you can see what you learn from the books that he writes, right? So anyway, so he goes to the card catalog at the University of Texas the next day, and he pulls every book he can find on runes. So a lot of these are very kind of dry academic works,
Hmm.
because the University of Texas was actually the center of Germanic studies in the United States at that time. So he just happens to be in the right place at the right time here.
Happenstance. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But he also there's a book on the shelf by a German named Karl Spiesberger, who was a member of the Fraternitas Saturni, was a magical order in Germany in the 20th century and continues until today, but was
Was it the
also
Brotherhood
working.
of Saturn? Or
Yeah.
yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Um, and this book is called Rune Magic. It's actually in German, Rune Magie, but he knew German well enough to read it at the time. And this was actual practices, actual things to do, like say these words, do these things. Here's theory behind magic of the runes, etc. So he begins to kind of work with this on his own because he realizes like you can't just be an armchair magician. You have to actually work with it. Same thing as like you have to see your performance of Shakespeare to really understand it. You can't just read it on the page and get the exact same feel from it. Same thing as you can't just read about riding a bicycle. You have to actually try to do it before you know what you're talking about. So he embarks on all these practices with the runes and he begins to write. He's a graduate student at the time studying Germanic languages, etc. Ends up getting his PhD in Germanic languages in 1984 and all that. And so he's at the same time he's a practicing magician. He's experimenting and he's writing down to kind of share it with others, kind of process his understanding, inspire others to work with it. Um, so in 1980, he forms an organization called the Rune Guild, which still continues
Hmm.
to this day. I'm a member of that as well. And in 1984, the same year that he received his PhD in Germanic languages, he also his book Futhark was published. That's the first book that he wrote about the runes. Well, the first one was published in any event, and this begins in large part the kind of the current interest in runes as a magical practice. Some people have worked with these things without realizing the influence of flowers on them. Some have had some, you know, or maybe not are not enthusiastic about his works for various reasons. Most of them are their own BS, not anything that has anything to do with him.
Hmm.
But by any objective measurement, he's kind of at the epicenter of the kind of the revival of runic magic as a practice in the current age. And one of the things that sets his work apart in large ways, which has been there from the beginning, is that he always starts with the factual information first.
Yeah.
Then you move on to what is my subjective interpretation of things, and you try to keep the two separate, but integrated too, because they need to inform each other. As a
Okay.
magician scholar, not just a magician or a scholar. That they integrate
Hmm. Hmm.
as well. Um, Now, and what's sometimes underappreciated as well is because of that connection with the Spiesberger book, which was
Oh,
coming from a very enlist perspective. Those practices are kind of informing what he's doing as well because we have little information about what the actual practices were. We can
hmm.
we have some things written around in the Eddas. We can infer some things about the way that they were using certain materials and the like. But in terms of a huge entire system of what was being done back in the Elder Futhark period and beyond, we don't know because the information isn't there. But if you know enough about the actual factual information behind it, and you are investigating based off of scholarly insight supported by by scholarly information, then you can do a reasonably good job of recreating in modern terms what those things were. So it's not
Hmm.
reenacting what they were doing, it's casting it into a form that makes sense to us now, but based as much as possible on the ways of thinking about them that were part of the original people doing this.
Okay. Now, how about the starry wisdom and the connection between the psyche and the night? That seems interesting right there.
Yeah.
You want me to
So
elaborate on
Starry,
that?
for sure. So Starry Wisdom, as a name, comes from H.P. Lovecraft. The story The Haunter of the Dark, which I've already mentioned is my favorite of all of his stories. So in that there is a an abandoned church of the Starry Wisdom sect. So he referred to as the disliked and unorthodox Starry Wisdom sect. That the main character in the story stumbles across, and he stumbles across an object called the Shining Trapezohedron.
Hmm.
And what the Starry Wisdom sect was doing, what they were eventually run out of town for. That's why the church is abandoned. But like everybody's afraid to go near it, but he sees it from the distance, and so he's got to find out what is this place. He's drawn to it, but he doesn't know why. And so when he finds this object, the shining trapezohedron was used by them. It's supposed to be this unfathomably ancient stone that probably fell from the heavens at some point that allows those using it to kind of see things not of this earth, um, much like a telescope does. Um, uh, but the starry wisdom as an idea there is the idea that the patterns of the stars are intertwined with the patterns of humans.
Hmm.
So, humans were a stargazing species from even well before the written record. Um, because we have such ancient knowledge around the movements of the stars, the movement of the planets, the movements of the moon, the movements of the sun, and all that comes from observation, just repeated observation over time. And in some cases, you have to watch for decades to see the patterns. So not only were they
Hmm.
interested enough to keep watching, but they were also interested enough to pass it on and to keep records, whether oral records or then later written records. Now, when you're watching the movements of the stars, you start to see patterns and you start to find important things. And because you're the person that can see these important things, you become important to those people who are in power. A very common example to use to describe that is the annual flooding of the Nile River in Egypt. So it's very important that you know when that's going to happen. As it happens, this is something that came from long years of observation. They understood that then when the star Sirius would basically be just rising at sunset, if I remember correctly, it's either sunset or dawn, I forget which.
Hmm.
Um, that was the because of the cycles of the stars at that time. So we're talking 3000 BC or so. That coincided with the flooding of the Nile. Basically, that when you see that, the Nile is going to start flooding like a week from now.
Hmm.
And so this becomes a very important thing for you to know, which means that the people in power that need to help to provide for the people need to kind of explain to them, okay, now is the time to plant your crops, or now is the time to prepare to harvest your crops, etc. Um, so knowing the movements of the stars becomes a gateway to power. Um, and and so as well as things like predicting eclipses, predicting periodic comets, and the like. So we have a very long history as a species of recognizing patterns within the stars and the relation to the patterns of humans on Earth. And so that's kind of what the essence of starry wisdom is. It's understanding that there's a connection here, and this is not saying that the stars are causing the flood. That was never part of the Egyptian belief. But they understood that there's some connection that's allowing us to see what's happening and when it's going to happen as a result of it. So very kind of powerful magic for the time. And of course, this wouldn't have been common knowledge. This would have been that only the select few knew. So they would be consulted to decide. Let us know when you know when it's time to when the Nile was about to flood, right? So they wouldn't necessarily tell the pharaoh how they knew. They would just say, "Oh, we know, trust," and the
Trust
fact
us.
that the fact that a week later it did flood means, yeah, you were right. So you earned that trust.
Hmm. Okay.
It's not just believe us
All right.
blindly. It's believe us because you've seen that we're right, and you saw we were right, yeah, last year and the year before and the year before and the year before. So you earned that trust at that point. Um, Now, from a magical perspective, right, we can draw things like, for example, there's another Egyptian example that's very pertinent with this. There was a foundation laying ceremony that was commonly employed in the Old and the Middle Kingdoms that called the stretching of the cord. Now,
Hmm.
if you've ever laid a foundation for anything like a little house or a barn or whatever, you kind of stretch out. Okay, this is where we're going to build it. This is where it starts, etc. And you can do that. That doesn't need magic and myth to do that, right? You can just pull out the geometry, figure it out,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
But the symbolic part that they added to this was there was a goddess named Seshat. Seshat was sometimes the companion of Thoth and a goddess of writing herself.
Hmm.
But she was also a leopard goddess. That was the form that she was visualized in. And they saw the leopard, the leopard has, the dark spots on the lighter colored fur. They saw this kind of like an inversion of the night sky, where you have the dark sky and the lighter colored stars against the background. So they kind of like, if like the Hermetic idea of as above, so below, there are kind of scenes like, oh, maybe there's kind of like a symbolic connection here that they used. And they would the priest of Seshat would be consulted to invoke the goddess, and in fact they would typically have someone bearing a leopard skin um, cloak, basically physically portraying the goddess as part of laying the foundation. And it was not only uh, part of the reason that they were connecting with the stars and the movements of the stars is they wanted to do it at specific times to make sure they were favorable times in which to do this. And this is where, there's a lot of blurring between astrology and astronomy here. So you can't really tease them apart in ancient thinking between one versus the other. They were all intertwined. They were the same thing symbolically as far as they were concerned.
Hmm.
So here it's you're making sure you're reading the stars to know if it's the right time to do this. You are calling down the stars through the manifestation of the goddess Seshat, invoking her favor, invoking her wisdom to know that this is right. You are stretching the cord at the right time and in the right place and in the right dimensions, um, which is, if you think about it, as a form of writing. It's almost like a form of geomancy, which literally means
Hmm.
earth writing, where you can you're writing out in the foundation through the cord representing the boundaries of it. So this is part of what Lovecraft is. He may not have been drawing on those things in particular, but this is the type of ideas that Lovecraft was referencing with
Okay.
Starry Wisdom. Um, the ones that understand these patterns and understand how they relate to the patterns of humans, whether or not they see a causal thing there, just see a relation there. This brings a certain kind of power, and it brings a certain kind of symbolic understanding that you can bring to bear in these things as well.
Okay.
And
Hmm.
so that idea, I was kind of introduced to that around the same time I was introduced to Lovecraft. One of my very close friends and mentors in the temple, that's the core of her work, is working with Starry Wisdom. So I've learned quite a lot about it from her as well. But yeah, it's an interesting practice and you mentioned seeing this on my website as well. Um, I broke it into several chunks, but there's a lengthy essay on that site about Starry Wisdom and the Left Hand Path as well for readers that want to check that out at infernalgeometry.com.
Now, okay, infernalgeometry.com. Yeah, that's the one. So how
Yeah.
about the third book? You said you're working on a third book. Is that going to be about Brotherhood of Saturn, or what's the
Mm.
or
No,
what's
I'm
the?
not actively working on a book currently. I'm
Oh,
mulling
okay,
over ideas for things that I might create, but um, nothing solid at the moment. I'm not the most efficient writer, um, partially because I have a busy life otherwise. So
okay,
writing is my it's not my main gig, so
okay.
it kind of has to fit
Gotcha.
in with other things.
Right on. Well, Toby, I'd like to thank you for coming out today. I mean, there's like huge technical difficulties on my side. I don't understand the radio room in here. It's getting annoying right now. So I'm gonna
Yeah,
leave it
sorry it's a
on.
bit difficult, but I'm glad we were able to talk. And it should be fine in the recording at least. So I hope
Yeah,
that's the
that's
case.
what. Hey, hopefully, and I'll let you know, post and share and everything like that.
No, for sure. No, it's been a great conversation. I really enjoyed talking with you. Looking forward to
Yeah,
when
it
this comes out.
was a pleasure. Thank you, Toby. Okay,
Thanks.
bye. Okay.